Well, good morning, church. If you're watching this video, then you weren't with us for worship this morning. Yes, as you have probably heard either by phone or by email, we are reopening up our worship service effective Sunday the 16th. And we are calling it the Breezeway Revival. Since we're not meeting indoors, we're meeting out of doors. And if there's not enough room to sit in the breezeway, you can camp out underneath the old oak tree. Or in the alternative, you can come and stay in the comfort of your own car. Just crank up the radio and you can worship from the comfort of your vehicle. And if, on the other hand, you're not watching this video because the video of the live service is what we were using, then I'm just kind of talking to myself. So that notwithstanding, we're grateful that you came to listen, but more importantly, really encourage you to come back to our corporate worship at Oak Hill starting the 16th of August. You know, this has been a long process, and some of us can feel like we're kind of in the pits, and that's the name of the lesson today. And if you felt that way, or either in the past or currently, you're in good company. In 1985, the comedian Irma Bombeck wrote a book that said, "If life is a bowl of cherries, then why am I in the pits?" She had a very humorous way of looking at life, and she was a very interesting individual. But today, I've entitled the lesson "In the Pits," and it's taken from Genesis chapter 37, verses 18 through 25. Again, I encourage you, read your Bible every day, whether it's a verse or it's a chapter or it's a book. Be in God's Word so He can speak to you. Genesis chapter 37, verses 18 through 25. They spotted him off in the distance. By the time he got to them, they had cooked up a plot to kill him. The brothers were saying, "Here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him and throw him into one of these old cisterns. We can say that a vicious animal ate him up. We'll see what his dreams amount to." Reuben heard the brothers talking and intervened to save him. Hey, we're not going to kill him. No murder. Go ahead and throw him in this cistern out here in the wild, but don't hurt him. Reuben planned to go back later and get him out and take him back to his father. When Joseph reached his brothers, they ripped off the fancy coat he was wearing, grabbed him, and threw him into a cistern. The cistern was dry. There wasn't any water in it. Then they sat down and ate their supper. You know, I've run into many people, as you have too, and one was a woman and she was trembling. You know, that kind of inner tremor that you can sense with even the slightest hand on a shoulder. She was in the grocery store. Her eyes were teary and her chin was quivering. He'd left her. After 20 years of marriage, 3 kids, and a dozen moves, he was gone. He traded her in for a younger model. Or this guy, he had just been fired, and the ouster was entirely his fault. He'd made some stupid, inappropriate remarks at work. These crude and offensive statements were actually what he had uttered. His boss canned him. Now he's a 57-year-old unemployed manager in a struggling economy. He feels terrible, and he sounds even worse. His wife is angry. His kids are really confused. Or that high school student. She's fresh out of high school, and she's hoping to get into college in the coming months. But her life hasn't been easy. When she was 6 years old, her parents divorced. When she was 15, they subsequently remarried, and then they divorced 2 years later. Her parents told her to choose. You can either live with mom or you can live with dad. All these, what a mess. All these examples in the pits. And the question is, can God use chaos for good? And the answer comes from another pit. It was a deep, dark pit, so steep that the boy couldn't climb out. Had he been able to, his brothers would have just shoved him back into the hole anyway. They were the ones who'd thrown him in. Genesis chapter 37, verses 23 through 25 said, when Joseph reached his brothers, they ripped off the fancy coat he was wearing, grabbed him, and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was dry. There wasn't any water in it. Then they sat down to eat their supper. An abandoned cistern. Jagged rocks and roots extended from its sides, where this 17-year-old boy lay at the very bottom. He had spindly arms and scrawny legs. His eyes are wide with fear. His voice is hoarse from all the screaming that he's been doing. And it wasn't like his brothers didn't hear him. Because 22 years later, when a famine had tamed the brothers' swagger and guilt had dampened, finally, their pride, they would confess in Genesis chapter 42, verse 21, we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Now, these are the great-great-grandsons of Abraham. They are the sons of Jacob. They are couriers of God's covenant to a galaxy of people. Tribes will carry their banners. The name of Jesus Christ will appear in their family tree. They're the Scripture's equivalent of royalty. But on this particular day, they were the Bronze Age version of a very dysfunctional family. They probably could have had their own reality show, or at a minimum been guests on the Jerry Springer show. And in the shadow of a sycamore, within the earshot of Joseph's appeals, they chew on venison and pass the wineskin. Hearts as hard as the Canaanite desert that they're hurting. Lunch mattered more to them than their brother because they despised him. In Genesis chapter 37, verses 4 and 5, and then skipping to verse 8 and skipping to verse 11, let me just tell you some experts. They hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Skipping forward, they hated him even more. Skipping forward, they hated him. Skipping further, his brothers envied him. Do you get the point? These brothers hated Joseph. And here is an explanation as to why. The boy's father pampered Joseph like he was some prized calf. Jacob had two wives, Leah and Rachel. But he only had really one love, and that was for Rachel. So when Rachel died, Joseph kept her memory alive by fawning all over their firstborn son. The brothers worked all day. Joseph basically played all day. They wore clothes from a second-hand store. Joseph wore a hand-stitched, multicolored coat with embroidered sleeves. They slept in the bunkhouse. He had a queen-size bed in his own room. While they ran the family herd, Joseph, who was Daddy's little darling, stayed home. Jacob treated his 11th son, Joseph, like he was a firstborn. And the brothers spat at just the sight of their younger brother, Joseph. To say that the family was in crisis would be like saying that, I don't know that a grass hut might be just a little unstable during a hurricane. The brothers caught Joseph far away from home, 60 miles away from Daddy's protection, and then they went nuclear on him. Genesis chapter 37, verses 23 and 24 said, they ripped off the fancy coat he was wearing, grabbed him, and threw him into the cistern. Did you hear those words? Those are defiant verbs. Ripped, grabbed, threw. They not only wanted to kill Joseph, but then to hide the evidence as well. I mean, this was a premeditated murder plot from the outset. Because in verse 20, it says, say that a vicious animal ate him up. So they had premeditated the murder of their brother long before they ever took action. And Joseph, he never saw the assault coming. It's not like he climbed out of bed that morning and thought, I'd better get dressed in some padded clothing because today's the day I'm going to get tossed into a hole. The attack had caught him completely off guard. And I'm thinking, probably so did yours. Joseph's pit came in the form of a cistern, which were hollowed out holes to catch rainwater, to subsequently feed cattle when it was raining no longer. But maybe yours comes from a diagnosis. Maybe it comes from a foster home. Maybe it comes from some sort of traumatic injury. Maybe yours comes even from a pandemic. Joseph was thrown in a hole and despised. And you? Thrown maybe in an unemployment line and completely forgotten. Thrown into a divorce and subsequently abandoned. Thrown into a bed and abused. It's called the pit. And it's a kind of death. It's waterless. It's austere. And frankly, some people never recover. For them, life is reduced to the singular quest of getting out and never being hurt again. But that's easier said than done, because pits don't have any easy exits. And Joseph's story gets worse before it gets better. Abandonment led to enslavement, then entrapment, then imprisonment. I mean, he was sucker punched. He was sold out. He was mistreated. People made promises to him only to break them, offered gifts to him only to take them back. I mean, if hurt were a desert, then Joseph was sentenced to a life of hard labor in the Mojave. But Joseph never gave up. Bitterness never staked its claim in his heart. Anger never metastasized into hatred. His heart never hardened. His resolve never vanished. He not only survived, he thrived. He ascended like a helium balloon to become an Egyptian official, promoted to a chief servant. Then the prison warden placed him over the inmates. Then the Pharaoh, the highest ruler on the planet, shoulder tapped Joseph to serve as his prime minister. By the end of Joseph's life, he was the second most powerful man in his entire generation. And it's not hyperbole to say that he saved the entire world from starvation. But how did he do that? Not the mechanics of how he accomplished these things, but how did he do it from inside? How did he flourish in the midst of tragedy? I mean, we don't have to speculate. Some 20 years later, we know that the roles are reversed. Joseph is now the strong one, and his brothers are the weak ones. And they had come to Joseph in absolute dread and fear for their lives. They feared he would settle the score and throw them into a pit of Joseph's own making. But Joseph didn't do that. And in his explanation to his brothers, we find what was Joseph's inspiration all these years. Because it says in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result and to preserve many people alive. You see, intended evil becomes eventual good in God's hands. So Joseph essentially ties himself to that pillar of promise and held on for dear life. Nothing in his story glosses over the presence of evil. I mean, actually, it's quite the contrary. There's blood stains and tear stains everywhere you look. Joseph's heart was rubbed raw against the rocks of disloyalty and miscarried justice. Yet time and time again, God redeemed Joseph's pain. The torn robe then became a royal robe. The pit became a palace. The broken family grew old together. The very acts intended to destroy God's servant turned out to strengthen him. You meant evil against me, Joseph told his brothers, using a Hebrew verb that traces its meaning to the word weave. So, in other words, what Joseph was saying was, you wove evil together. But God rewove it together for good. God, the master weaver. He stretches the yarn and intertwines the colors. The ragged twine gets intertwined with the velvet strings, and the pains get intertwined with the pleasures. Nothing escapes God's reach. Every king, every despot, every weather pattern, every virus is at his command. He passes the shuttle back and forth across the generations, and as he does so, a design begins to emerge. Satan weaves, but God reweaves. And that's the meaning behind Joseph's words. God meant it for good in order to bring about many people alive. The Hebrew word translated as bringing about or bring about is actually a construction term. It describes a task or building project, maybe similar to the ones that you've probably driven through on your way to work. 3 lanes have been reduced down to 1, transforming a morning commute into a daily stew. The California interstate projects, as far as I've been able to see, are kind of like human history. They have seemingly been in development since before time even began. They just never are over. Cranes hover overhead, workers hold signs and kind of lean on shovels, while several million people are grumbling. How long will this take? How much longer can I endure this? Now, highway engineers, on the other hand, have a much different attitude about Carmageddon. They endure the same traffic jams and detours like all of us. But they do it with a much better attitude. And do you know why? It's because they know how these projects develop. And they know they will eventually get finished. The project engineers and designers know this because they've seen the plans and they know the builder. And by giving us stories like Joseph's, God, I think, allows us to study his plans. And in Joseph's case, those plans, quite frankly, look pretty messy. Brothers dumping a brother, entitlements, famines, and family feuds scattered about like nails in cement bags on a freeway project. Satan's logic was sinister and simple. It was to destroy the family of Abraham and thereby destroy his seed, which was Jesus Christ. All of hell, it seems, had set its target on Jacob's boys. But watch the master builder at work. He clears the debris. He stabilizes the structure. He bolts trusses until the chaos of Genesis chapter 37, verse 34, which said they cast him into the pit, becomes the triumph of Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Life for many people. You see, God is this master weaver. He's this master builder. And he redeemed the story of Joseph. And if he did it for Joseph, he can redeem your story too. You know, you'll get out of the pits. It's not like it's forever. I know you fear you won't. We all do. We fear that the depression will never lift. We fear that the yelling will never stop. We fear that the pain will never leave. And we fear that life will never, ever be normal again. Here in the pits, surrounded by super steep walls and angry brothers, we wonder, will this gray sky ever brighten? Will these loads ever lighten? Because we feel stuck. We feel trapped. We feel locked in. We feel like we've been predestined for failure. Will I ever exit this pit? And the answer is yes, you will. Out of the lion's den for Daniel, or out of the prison for Peter, out of the whale's belly for Jonah, out of Goliath's shadow for David, out of the storm for the disciples, out of the disease for the lepers, out of doubt for Thomas, out of the grave for Lazarus, and out of shackles for Paul. You see, church, God gets us through stuff. He does. He gets us through the Red Sea onto dry ground. You can read about that in Exodus chapter 14, verse 22. He can get us through the wilderness. That's Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 5. He can get us through the valley of the shadow of death. That's the 23rd Psalm, verse 4. And he can get us through the deep sea. That's in Psalm chapter 77, verse 19. The word through seems to be kind of a favorite of God's. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2, he says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. Now, in all candor, it's not going to be painless. For instance, have you wept your final tear? Or have you received your final round of maybe chemotherapy? Not necessarily. Will your unhappy marriage all of a sudden be made happy in a heartbeat? No, that's not likely. Will your pre-COVID life return to normal overnight? Probably not. Are you exempt from a trip to the cemetery? Does God guarantee the absence of struggle and the abundance of strength? Not in this life, church. But he does pledge to reweave your pain for a much higher purpose. And again, candidly, it may not be quick either. I mean, Joseph was 17 years old when his brothers abandoned him. He was 37 when he saw them again. That's 20 years. And another couple of years passed, after that before he actually was able to see his father again. That's 22 years. I mean, sometimes God takes his time. For instance, he took 120 years to prepare Noah for the flood. He took 80 years to prepare Moses for his work. God called a young David to be king, only to return him back to the sheep pasture and then make him run for his life like Ben Gazzara, if you remember that, for more than a decade from a crazy king that he had been anointed to replace. He called Paul to be an apostle and then isolated him in Arabia for 3 years. Jesus was on the earth for 3 decades before he built anything more than a kitchen table. How long will God take with you? I don't know. You don't know. He may take his time. His history is redeemed in lifetimes, not, unfortunately, in minutes. But God will use the pits in your life for his good. I mean, we see an absolutely perfect mess, and God sees a perfect chance to train, to test, to teach, even a future prime minister. We see a prison, God sees a kiln. We see a famine, God sees the relocation of his chosen people. We call it Egypt, God calls it protective custody, where the sons of Jacob can finally escape Canaanite cruelty to multiply in peace and do it abundantly. We see Satan's tricks and ploys. God sees Satan tripped and foiled. You're a version of Joseph, just in now your own generation. You represent a challenge to Satan's plan. You carry something of God within you, something that's noble, something that's holy, something the world needs. The world needs your wisdom. The world needs your kindness. The world needs your mercy. The world needs your skill. And if Satan can neutralize you, he can mute your influence and silence your voice. I believe that the story of Joseph is in the Bible to teach us to trust God to trump evil. What Satan intends for evil, God, the master weaver, God, the master builder, redeems for good. Joseph would probably be the first one to tell you that life in the pits stinks. Yet for all of its rottenness, the pit does at least this much. It forces you to look up. It forces you to look up, for someone up there must come down here and give you a hand. And church, God did that for Joseph at just the right time. And God did that for Joseph in just the right way. And God will do the same for you. And the truth is, he already has. God bless you.